$33 million. Vanished. And the person who took it was a 23-year-old woman sitting in a coffee shop with a laptop. No weapons, no crew in masks, no bank robberies, just code, patience, and a system full of holes she had figured out how to crawl through. The FBI's cyber division called it one of the most technically sophisticated fraud operations they had ever seen from a single network. Financial regulators cited it in congressional testimony. 18 banks quietly updated their security protocols because of it. Her name was Avi Ford. And this is how she did it, and how she got caught. The first indication that something was wrong came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March 2022, when a fraud analyst at a San Francisco-based financial technology company flagged a pattern too precise to be human error: 47 transactions, each just below the $10,000 federal reporting threshold, had passed through a network of shell accounts over the course of 4 days. The money moved fast, in through ACH transfers, out through cryptocurrency exchanges. And by the time the analyst escalated the alert, most of it was already gone. What the analyst could not have known was that this was not the beginning of the operation. It was the end of one cycle. The network responsible had been running for 11 months, and the woman who built it had just turned 23. Her name was Avi Ford. She had grown up in Fremont, California, a quiet suburb in the East Bay, the kind of place where ambitious kids go to college and don't look back. Her parents were software engineers who had built a life from scratch after immigrating from Pune in the late 1990s. She inherited their work ethic and then some. She was quiet in school, consistently excellent. By 17, she was writing Python scripts that her classmates couldn't read. She enrolled at UC Berkeley, declared computer science, and was gone by the end of her sophomore year. Not expelled, but pulled away by something she found far more interesting than any classroom could offer. She had discovered that the American financial system had gaps. Not metaphorical ones. Actual, exploitable vulnerabilities in the identity verification systems used by mid-tier banks and fintech platforms. The kind of gaps that could, with the right tools and the right timing, allow money to move in ways that were invisible to automated monitoring. Until they weren't. By January 2021, Avi had assembled 3 collaborators, each recruited through encrypted channels on forums she had spent months quietly building credibility in. She didn't meet any of them in person, not once. The first was Marcus Webb, 31, a former network security contractor from Dallas who had lost his federal clearance in 2019 after a disciplinary review. He was skilled, bitter, and available. The kind of guy who felt the system had already failed him and was more than ready to return the favor. He handled infrastructure, the servers, the rotating IP pools, the automated scripts that validated stolen identity data against public records. The second was Jinho Park, 27, a graduate student in financial engineering at Stanford. No criminal record, no red flags. From the outside, he looked like exactly what he was, a brilliant, quiet academic. But he was also the architect of what the team called the cascade model, a layered transaction strategy that made stolen funds nearly impossible to freeze in time. Investigators would later call his work forensically sophisticated. That's federal agent language for, we were genuinely impressed, and we wish we weren't. The third was Diana Reyes, 29, a former bank teller from Sacramento. She brought something the others couldn't fake. An instinctive understanding of how real people talk when they're stressed, confused, and calling their bank. She handled all the social engineering, the voice calls, the pretexting, the carefully scripted conversations that reset passwords and confirmed fraudulent address changes while customer service reps typed notes into systems across the country. She didn't just sound credible, she sounded worried. There's a difference, and she knew it. Together, the 4 of them operated with no name, no meetings, and no loose ends, communicating exclusively through a custom-built encrypted application that Avi had coded herself. They called it the Corridor. Synthetic identity fraud was not a new concept. Combine a real social security number with a fake name and address, build a financial identity around it, and use that identity to access credit. The scheme had existed for years. What made Avi's operation different was the scale, the automation, and above all, the patience. Over 11 months, the team created 412 synthetic identities. Each one was carefully aged. seeded with small, unremarkable transactions for 4 to 6 weeks before any fraudulent activity occurred. This process, known as credit seasoning, allowed the accounts to pass automated risk scoring and, in several cases, qualify for actual lines of credit. Once the accounts were ready, Marcus's infrastructure moved. Automated scripts hit 18 financial institutions simultaneously, submitting loan applications, requesting credit line increases, initiating balance transfers, all timed to land during overnight windows when manual review was least likely. If anything got flagged, Diana called. She had scripts for every escalation path. She had memorized the procedural language of Tier 1 customer service. She could mirror a representative's tone within seconds. Then, Jinho's cascade model kicked in. Money moved from originating accounts into a second layer of clean-looking accounts, then into crypto wallets, then into peer-to-peer exchanges with a trail fractured into dozens of directions, automatically routed away from any wallet address flagged in known fraud databases. By the time the first subpoena landed, $33.4 million had already moved through the system. The FBI's Cyber Division and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, began coordinating in April 2022. The case landed on the desk of Special Agent Priya Halverson, a 10-year veteran out of the San Francisco field office, who had spent her career working identity fraud tied to organized crime. She later testified that this case was unlike anything she had seen. Every layer we peeled back had another layer under it. They had thought carefully about what happens when someone like me starts looking. For months, the digital trail went nowhere useful. The operation's security was too tight, too layered, too well designed. The break came from something entirely human. In October 2022, Diana Reyes called a fraud department at a regional bank in Ohio. Routine pretexting call, resetting credentials on a synthetic account. But during that call, she used a phrase, a specific, slightly unusual way of describing an account's transaction history. A phrase that matched, almost word for word, a complaint filed the previous year by a victim at an entirely different institution, in an entirely different state. A fraud investigator in Ohio flagged it. The report went to FinCEN. A data analyst indexed it against a database of flagged language patterns. The match came back at a 94% similarity score. One sentence, spoken out loud on a recorded call. And just like that, the whole architecture started to crack. Within 4 months, investigators had subpoenaed records from 17 cloud hosting providers, obtained court orders across 3 foreign jurisdictions, and identified all 4 members of the team. Marcus Webb was found first. He had used a home internet connection for a single server access in November 2022. One mistake, one connection log. Jinho Park was identified through an academic paper he had co-authored in 2019. It used nearly identical language to describe transaction layering. His own published research gave him away. Avi Ford was last. The Corridor app she had built was never fully decrypted, but server registration records traced back to an email address she had abandoned in 2018, one she had incorrectly believed was untraceable. After everything she had built, everything she had secured, it was a 6-year-old email address that connected her to all of it. The arrests came on February 14, 2023. Valentine's Day. Several news outlets noted the irony. All 4 were taken into custody without incident. The federal indictment, filed in the Northern District of California, charged each defendant with wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy. Avi Ford faced 19 counts. The government's position was clear. She hadn't just participated, she had designed everything. Her attorney, federal defender Robert Choi, pushed back, arguing that the government was pinning a collaborative operation on one person. The judge noted it for the record, then denied bail. Trial began in September 2023 before United States District Judge Margaret Okonkwo. It lasted 4 weeks, 22 government witnesses, 3 days of forensic testimony on the transaction layering alone, representatives from 6 defrauded institutions on the stand, describing losses and the systems that hadn't caught it in time. The defense argued the digital evidence was too circumstantial, that the linguistic match, the single sentence that started everything, was too thin a thread to support the weight the government had placed on it. And Robert Choi made one quieter argument to the jury, less legal than human, that Avi Ford was 22 years old when this began. No record, no prior arrests. A young woman of extraordinary ability whose life had taken a turn that the evidence, for all its detail, didn't fully explain. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Guilty, on all counts. For all 4 defendants, sentencing was January 19, 2024. 41 letters arrived at the court before that day, from teachers, family members, people who had known these 4 defendants as something other than what they had become. Several described Avi Ford in terms Judge Okonkwo acknowledged openly from the bench. "The court does not take any satisfaction in what must happen today. The choices that were made produced real harm. Not abstract institutional harm, but harm to individuals whose identities were weaponized, whose credit was destroyed, whose hours were consumed trying to undo damage they did not cause." Avi Ford, 14 years in federal prison. 3 years supervised release. $8.7 million in restitution. Marcus Webb, 11 years. Jin-Ho Park, 9 years, reduced in part for cooperating with investigators. Diana Reyes, 8 years. All 4 remanded immediately. The case, United States versus Ford et al., was cited the following year in congressional testimony as a landmark example of synthetic identity fraud at scale, and of how cross-institutional data sharing can crack cases that pure digital forensics cannot. The linguistic pattern that broke the investigation became a formalized FinCEN protocol. The Corridor app was never fully decrypted. Prosecutors called it an ongoing, unresolved risk in their sentencing memo, and recommended that any future sentence modification consider Avi's cooperation on that front. 18 financial institutions recovered a combined $4.1 million of the $33.4 million taken. The rest is, in the words of one investigator during a closed briefing, later leaked to a trade publication, effectively gone. The 412 people whose social security numbers were used without their knowledge spent an average of 14 months trying to restore their financial lives, disputing charges they didn't make, rebuilding credit scores they hadn't damaged, explaining to landlords, lenders, and employers why their records looked the way they did. Some of them received letters in the mail, notifications that their identity had been used, their information compromised, their name attached to debt they never agreed to carry. Some of them are still sorting through it today. And Avi Ford? She's sitting in a federal facility, waiting to find out if an appeals court sees 14 years differently than Judge Okonkwo did. The appeal remains pending.